Highbridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Bourbon King, The Life and Crimes of George Remus, Prohibition's Evil Genius, by Bob Batchelor, read by Joe Barrett. Prologue. Awash in Red. "Look me up. I've just shot my wife." Emmett Kurgan, chief of detectives, looked back at the man in disbelief. George Remus bounced back and forth in front of the desk, then sank into a chair and surrendered. At one time rich, famous, powerful, and feared, he had been king of the bootleggers, and Kurgan recognized him right away. Frank McNeil, another Cincinnati police officer in the room, stopped for a moment, unsure how to proceed. Kurgan stood quickly, grasping what Remus had admitted. Murderers usually had to be caught. Earlier that day, George felt the blood slick on his hand and looked down in horror. His white silk shirt, crisp and unsoiled only several minutes before, was now awash in red. The pearl-handled pistol heavy in his grip, Remus glanced up, turning toward the street. Cars careened to a halt, and bystanders cried out in disbelief. He scanned the area for the dark blue Buick and its driver. The car was gone. Just then Remus heard the women's screams and the cries of children who had been playing nearby. He searched for an escape, his eyes darting left and right in the morning sunlight that washed over Eden Park. Turning away from the red and white rotunda at the heart of the park, Remus disappeared into the thick trees lining the area. He could still hear shrieks echoing in the air. Emerging from the woods minutes later, Remus surfaced on Gilbert Avenue. He wandered south toward downtown. He continued to look back over his shoulder. A local Studebaker dealer named William Halvershorn spotted him. He pulled over, offering a lift. Swinging open the dark green coupe door, Remus poked his head inside, and then took a seat next to the man, thanking him profusely. George kept up a constant patter. At times the driver struggled to follow his passenger's stream of thought. The stranger spoke in bursts, with a German accent quite strong at times. "Take me to the Central Station," he repetitively muttered between flurries of conversation. At first Halvershorn thought Remus was a traveling salesman, so he drove off toward the Pennsylvania Station train depot at the corner of Pearl and Butler Streets, Cincinnati's downtown hub. When they arrived, Halvershorn pulled the car up to the curb. He wished the man well. George popped open the door, stepped out, and realized he was at the train depot downtown. "Well, you don't know who I am, do you?" Remus asked the car salesman. "No, sir, I don't," he replied. "Well, my name is George E. Remus." "Mr. Remus of fame? Well, I am glad to meet you." Then is when he told me he had done some shooting in the park. Halvershorn would remember later. With the confession, Remus closed the door. As the Studebaker pulled away, George turned. He saw a group of cabs and hailed one over, frustrated because he thought he'd told Halvershorn to take him to the police station. Still, it was only 30 minutes after he had fled Eden Park when Remus calmly walked into Cincinnati's 1st District Police Headquarters. Within that time, law enforcement across Cincinnati and northern Kentucky had been alerted to the heinous crime. As Remus approached Kurgan, the station's officer on duty, police were combing the area for the former bootleg baron. "I will never forget the expression on her face when I was pulling her to me and she realized I'd gotten her. She turned that hypocritical face to me and said, 'Oh, don't hurt me, Daddy. You know I love you,'" George said, exhausted. Part 1. Birth of a Bootlegger. 1. Napoleon of the Bar. George Remus leaned in close to his client, whispering into his ear. He glanced over at the jury, turned away, then took a longer look. The attorney noted their faces, the slightest reactions. He stared ahead, stopping on each juror for a split second. They saw his steel-blue eyes home in on them. Then, swinging up from the table, he bounded to his feet. George tugged at his shirt sleeves and smoothed out the thin wrinkles in his jacket. Ready to pounce, he pushed toward the jury box. Remus stopped short. He smiled, letting them see his confidence, letting it wash over them. A singular moment to plead for his client's life. Behind him, the accused man sat stone-faced. another in a long succession of defendants who faced the gallows. The murderer felt the weight of the proceedings push down on his shoulders and chest. His wife was dead. Doomed, observers thought. The prosecution had built a thorough case, proving that he had poisoned her. It was a sinister thing, killing one's spouse. A guilty conviction meant sure death. Investigators had even found the bottle he used in the plot. Thoughts of the electric chair hung in everyone's minds. Doomed! Everyone could see it. After a momentary pause, George turned fast and snatched the bottle from the table. He spun the container around so all the jurors clearly caught a glimpse of the label. He raised it to them, as if toasting them at the end of a raucous night out in the town. Each person determining the fate of this wife-killer saw the familiar dark skull and crossbones that adorned those types of toxins. "There's been a lot of talk about poison in this case," Remus exclaimed, "but it is a lot of piffle. Look!" Before anyone in the courtroom even had a chance to gasp, George dropped the deadly bottle to his lips. He gulped down the remaining liquid. Empty! The jurors reacted in unison. They were spellbound but horrified. Did they really just see that? Did he drink it? Certainly the jurors expected Remus to collapse, dead on the spot. George stood there motionless for a moment longer, then turned and placed the bottle back on the table. He made sure that the skull and crossbones faced the jurors. Rather than falling over, he continued on with his closing argument. Once again looking at each in turn, the attorney demanded that they return a not guilty verdict. Remus finished, spinning on his heels, and casually walked back to the defense table, where he stood at his client's side. After the judge gave final instructions, the jurors quietly shuffled out of the courtroom, each one glancing over at the lawyer. He'd swallowed the poison. They expected it to be the last time they saw him alive. 15 minutes later, they filed back into the packed room. After a tense few moments, "Not guilty," the foreman announced. He looked over at the judge. Immediately, catcalls reverberated around the room. Spectators gasped. Some covered their mouths with their hands, stunned. In the front of the room, George beamed and nodded toward the jury box. Remus, the Napoleon of the bar, they called him. Another win. The famous attorney had not only downed the poison, but his precarious gambit kept his client from the gallows. The jurors must have thought, well, if the poison isn't actually poison, then there is no way it was murder. They barely had time to hash out the details. The not guilty verdict seemed the only possibility. What no one in the courtroom seemed to know that day was that George Remus had been a successful pharmacist for more than a decade before making the odd career leap to lawyer. Putting his extensive pharmaceutical background to work, he knew exactly what antidote counteracted the poison in the bottle on the table. Trusting his deep knowledge and experience, he mixed and drank the potion before entering the courtroom. George knew that the toxin would be rendered harmless. Another Remus trick. Whether or not his client had murdered his wife did not mean much to Remus. His triumph, one of the many he had threaded together recently, meant keeping the man from death row. George would do anything to keep a client from that barbaric end. He had watched too many people go to the electric chair. In his mind, if the justice system created loopholes that only he were willing or intelligent enough to exploit, then he should not be criticized or sanctioned for taking those risks. No emotion, no shame, just victory. "I could have lasted 2 hours longer," George asserted, nearly breathless and waterlogged after 5 hours in the chilly Lake Michigan water. At 30 years old, Remus was older than most competitive swimmers, perhaps considered by most as too old to compete. But the pharmacist-turned-lawyer had mouths to feed and a full-time career, so he remained a true amateur. He relied on toughness to make up for the gap between his age and that of his rivals. George had entered the Chicago Athletic Association's 10-mile swimming marathon, a grueling course that ran from the Chicago Yacht Club to the South Shore Country Club. Although it was August, temperatures had dropped the morning of the race. A lilting wind turned steady, which created choppy conditions. The weather, always a wild card in the Windy City, turned what swimmers thought was an achievable distance race into an endurance test. Even in perfect conditions, these contests were exhilarating but brutal for the combatants. A 10-mile water race, like a marathon on land, demanded a combination of stamina and mental resolve. Unlike their counterparts on foot, though, swimmers faced extreme dangers. Battling waves and near hypothermia took a toll. Physical breakdown could happen in an instant, obliging race officials to watch from lifeboats to constantly oversee the competitors. Life and death hung in the balance. E.P. Swatek, the contestant pulled out of the water just before Remus, reportedly faced imminent danger. He survived because 2 men from shore had jumped in to save him. According to a reporter on the scene, the heroes helped keep him above water until a boat fished him out. Swatek lived but came out of the water delirious and in a weak condition. Several others had to be treated by medical personnel after being hoisted out of frigid Lake Michigan. Remus had been the last one of the swimmers pulled from the drink, urged, actually, by race officials. Endurance swimming was George's specialty. Like he had done in so many of his pursuits, Remus outlasted the competition, exhibiting extraordinary toughness and determination. A sports reporter who covered the race wrote, "The big fellow, although making little progress, was still in first-class condition." George himself said afterward, "I would not have given up the race if it were not for the judges calling me in and taking me into their boat." Contending that he was ready for 2 or 3 more hours, he explained that the owner of a launch brought some sandwiches, which I ate in the water. Athletic competition, particularly swimming and water polo, was a centerpiece of George's life. He joined a series of sporting associations, including the Chicago Athletic Association, which gave him standing and reputation on the local and national athletic scenes. Remus traveled the country, participating in events, even as his professional life flourished and his personal life became more complicated. In September 1907, a month after the Chicago swim, he qualified for the open water swimming national championship in St. Louis. The Windy City sent a strong contingent, driven by civic pride and the desire to prove that they were tougher than men from other locales. Spectators were attracted to the novelty of these long-distance swimming races. This was the era of Theodore Roosevelt's strenuous life, after all, drawn to the danger participants faced in attempting such feats. Crowds lined the banks to cheer on men from their hometowns, while more adventurous fans climbed aboard boats or skiffs to get a closer view of the action from the water. These vessels would become makeshift emergency ferries. Often spectators helped fish besieged swimmers out of the river, essentially saving lives when rowboats could not reach contestants fast enough. The grueling 10-mile championship race took place in a swift stretch of the Mississippi River and ended under the city's Eads Bridge. Reporters covering the event regaled readers with stories of failed attempts and daring rescues. Several men nearly lost their lives attempting to win the championship. Remus was not one of the first 10 finishers, but again demonstrated his grit by entering the race and competing against athletes that were often a decade younger. The exertion of staying in the water for hours and the determination to compete in these kinds of long-distance races were linchpins of George's evolving physical and mental condition, both in his early life and as he grew into manhood. His life had never been easy, from growing up in a poor German immigrant family to the long hours he worked to support and care for his parents. The endurance tests seemed a perfect complement to the way his mind blossomed. Struggle was a way of life for George when he was young, just as it had been for his parents Karl Franz Remus and Marie-Louise Karg. Karl was born in August 1849 in Friedeberg, one of 2 walled cities in Neumark, a region within the electorate of Brandenburg that had become part of Prussia in 1701. His brother Johann arrived in May 1850, but both parents died later the same year, suspected casualties of a cholera outbreak. Luckily, Frank and Amelia Karg took in the orphans. The local family ran a successful wool milling operation. As he grew up, the young orphan took on an apprenticeship with Mr. Karg. Young Karl began courting his mentor's daughter, Marie, and they fell in love. The older Karg evidently accepted the boy, who everyone now called Frank, a nickname earned out of respect for the Karg family patriarch. Marie and Frank were married in 1872 in Friedeberg, shortly after the end of the Franco-Prussian War. Frank's brother Johann also married a local girl named Julia, but details of her life have been lost to history. Marie and Frank started a family in Friedeberg. Some of their children, like so many millions across Europe in that era, died either in childbirth or infancy. 2 daughters lived, Elisabeth, born in her parents' hometown in 1875, and Martha, 4 years later in 1879. Between the girls, Marie and Frank welcomed their oldest son, George, on November 13, 1876. Over the ensuing decades, George played fast and loose with his birth year, usually listing it somewhere between 1874 and 1879. The date changed to fit whatever the circumstances were at the time. Frank and Marie did not have a particularly easy life in West Prussia, despite her family's middle-class status. In many respects, the situation worsened for the 5 Remus family members when they reached America. They traveled to the United States aboard the Fitlington, a passenger ship that had departed from Kristiansand, a bucolic seaside town on the southern tip of Norway. They arrived in New York City in June 1882. The Remus clan did not stay in New York City, unlike millions of immigrants who streamed into America. Instead, they moved south, settling for a short time in Baltimore. Soon, however, they moved halfway across the country to Milwaukee, a city rich in German and Prussian heritage. In the late 1880s, the Wisconsin city served as a haven for people arriving in America and claimed the highest percentage of foreign-born residents in the country. The Remuses would have felt at home in Milwaukee's extensive German neighborhoods, surrounded by people who spoke their language and had similar cultural norms. Frank, however, continued to struggle to find employment, and troubles continued to mount. Although family lore claimed that 2 American-born sons perished in infancy in Wisconsin, only one, Francis, was uncovered in official records. He died in childbirth in 1884. Not having much luck establishing a homestead or financial footing, the Remus family left Milwaukee and moved south to Chicago when George was 8 years old. While many immigrant families took advantage of the city's bustling industry and constant need for workers, the Remus's economic challenges persisted. Frank suffered chronic unemployment in the Windy City. When he found work, the pay amounted to only about $9 to $11 per week. The money did not go far, and a household with many hungry children to feed. It was a hardship, George said about his early years. The Remus family grew in Chicago. Another daughter, Anna, came into the world in 1889, while Herman was born in 1891. Frank's brother Johann also immigrated to the city, arriving in 1888 with his wife Julia and son John, who had been born in Posen, a city in Prussian Poland, on June 24, 1878. With little hope that his father could earn a steady living, George interceded, explaining, "I took hold of matters from the age of about 14 years and 3 months. February 1890, and assisted in supporting the family." As a matter of fact, the youngster soon became the main supporter of the family. Although a good student, George could not continue his education while working. He dropped out, opting for a job in the pharmacy that his uncle George Koch owned. His financial burden encompassed the entire family, extending to his 3 sisters, Elisabeth, Martha, and Anna, both before and after their later marriages. George also supported his younger brother, Herman, who had suffered a mysterious head injury as a boy. George would later explain that his brother had been hit in the head by a brick, unsure whether someone threw it or the object fell on him. The traumatic brain injury and resulting complications forced Herman to be admitted to the Kankakee Hospital for the Insane. He died there in 1913 at the age of 22. The financial obligations George carried put him under enormous strain. As a result, when he took over the economic reins as a young teenager, he distanced himself from his father, whom he considered an abusive alcoholic. As the oldest male sibling, he had to take on a guardian role for his sisters and brother. He would continue to provide for their well-being, but withdrew emotionally. Remus found a substitute passion for family love by developing an intense single-mindedness about sports and health. The young man was obsessive about swimming and took to the water whenever he could, diving headlong into rivers and lakes around Chicago with his boyhood friends. He allegedly swore off alcohol during his formative years. George had seen how the excursions down to the beer garden had changed his father, quickly withering him and further weakening the man's inner resolve. Even the occasional drink ran counter to George's dedication to exercise. His inner reserve of steadfastness became a defining trait. Years later, a physician would describe the youngster's behavior as hyperactivity, but also noted ominously, "He is emotionally unstable. He is devoid of normal emotional reaction." Even as a child, George became relentless in chasing success and tested himself in physical activities that required toughness. Meanwhile, the years of hardship and stress took a toll on George and his family. In the late 1880s and early 1900s, leaders in the push for state and national prohibition attacked casual drinking by German immigrants, which was a focal point of their culture, especially in the camaraderie and fellowship exhibited at beer gardens. As Frank's employment woes continued, his drinking increased, as did his time away from home. In 1916, Frank Remus left the world quietly, just as he had lived in his final years. The cause of death was an ailment diagnosed as heart disease. If family tales hold water, it is more likely that alcoholism was at the root of his deterioration. The German habit of drinking beer with meals was frowned upon in polite American society, so it is difficult to gauge whether the older Remus's consumption reached the threshold of alcoholism. Frank was 67 years old. Marie Remus, George's plain-spoken old-world German mother, lived for another dozen years. She passed away on December 10, 1928, in Cincinnati. Uncle George Clark treated his nephew well. George was allowed to spend more and more time at the pharmacy, located at 952 Milwaukee Avenue in Wicker Park, in the stately red-brick Christensen building, which had been built in 1887. The robust business district around the Wicker Park location and its vast green public park had attracted many German and Scandinavian immigrants to the neighborhood. The main thoroughfare held a mix of grocers, real estate offices, and saloons that many observers would later call a city within a city for its many amenities. Young George started as a clerk, learning about people by watching how they interacted with his uncle. Gradually, he took on more complicated tasks. As his workload increased, the teenager began sleeping in the store at night, primarily as a way to live frugally, but also establishing himself apart from his family. He still turned most of his earnings over to Frank and Marie, a dutiful son providing for his parents and siblings. Learning from his uncle helped George get a strong footing, but he wanted a more substantial life. Enrolling in pharmacy courses at night, George eventually passed the Illinois pharmacy examination when he was just 19 years old. Still 2 years away from being able to legally practice as a druggist, Remus took the most pragmatic route. He lied to the licensing board about his age. He heeded no rules or regulations that seemed illogical. As he came into manhood, George developed his own opinions about rules and regulations, creating an internal scale that guided his decision-making. Passing the examination served as a springboard. In later years, George liked to boast that although he only had $9.88 saved at the time he took the pharmacy test, due to supporting his parents and siblings, he was still able to buy the pharmacy from his uncle. Young Remus promised to pay Clark $6,000 through a series of loans that the older man helped him procure. George worked long hours to pay off the notes in little more than 2 years. As a trusted store owner, Remus's stature grew in the local community. Then he utilized this position to buy another store on credit for $4,500, just 3 blocks down the street. At 21 years old, George had already gained broad insight into the minds of his customers and patients by running the pharmacies, doling out basic medical advice, and working directly with several physicians. Looking for additional opportunities to make money, Remus took a 10-month basic optometry service course and passed the certification exam. The license enabled him to give patients routine eye care and permitted him to call himself Dr. Remus. George later admitted that he wanted the title to evoke respectability among his immigrant patients and among fellow business leaders. Though his title was primarily a status symbol for the young man, George didn't much believe in what passed as contemporary medicine anyway. From his pharmacist role, he realized that many medical prescriptions doctors ordered were pure claptrap. The endless pills were more or less placebos, meant to possibly fill some need but rarely addressed what truly ailed the patient. Despite its shortcomings, the system worked profitably. Doctors were viewed as authoritative community leaders, while patients received what they thought was proper treatment, even if the medications only loosely filled that definition and might be little more than a concentrated dosage of alcohol or some pain-killing or hallucinogenic powder. Pharmacists, George realized, played a significant role as caregivers in this chaotic system, particularly in the poor immigrant neighborhoods where he operated. Families did not have money to spare for more expensive office visits. He gained the trust of his German customers. In turn, they looked to him for advice. As a young, prosperous pharmacist, George took the path that many German immigrants would follow. He started a family. George thought that his first duty had always been building a strong financial standing for himself and his kin. He had little time for romance. Then Lillian Krauss became George's first serious love. After a quick courtship, Remus married Lillian, an accomplished pianist and music teacher, on July 10, 1899. He was about to turn 23 years old, while his new bride was 2 years younger. 9 months later, they welcomed a little girl to the family, naming her Romola. As she grew, Romola developed jet-black hair and dark eyes, like her mother. George was already balding and had a pale complexion, though sometimes tanned to a mottled brown with all the outdoor swimming. His most defining trait was piercing blue eyes that seemed to leap from his head when he looked at someone. His thick German accent rounded out as he aged, but he still spoke fluently with his countless immigrant customers. Remus also possessed an unheard-of level of brute strength. He was physically squat and powerful. Later, George would boast that before meeting Lillian, his love life was like every man, but not nearly as bad as most. He viewed himself as chivalrous, and definitely not a cad, like many successful young people. Without going into detail, Remus explained, "I could have had all kinds of women at my feet if I'd wanted them, but I did not take advantage of that." Yearning to capitalize on his intelligence and expand his business interests beyond the poor customers he served in Wicker Park, George created the Remus Pharmaceutical Company. Specializing in proprietary medicines, he cooked up a variety of treatments for common ailments, all using his personal brand: Remus Pain Celery Compound, Remus Pinkham Compound, Remus Liver Pills and Cathartic Pills, and stomach remedies and cough drops and lozenges. The Remus Pharmaceutical Company sold these creations, modifications of more popular tonics and elixirs sold by traveling salesmen and in large stores nationwide, in the German communities of Milwaukee and Chicago. George also founded the S&S Drug Company at the corner of 59th and Volstead in Chicago. The firm sold drugs wholesale to 250 to 500 retail druggists. Despite the successes he had as a business owner and pharmacist, working long hours during the day and conducting some rudimentary medical examinations, the young man dreamed of a more illustrious life. He did not lack gratitude for what the pharmacy had given him, a job at his uncle's shop when his father could no longer support the family, and the considerable wealth to buy that store, as well as another to run as his own. Remus just wanted more. The simplest route for George may have been medical school, but he had reservations about becoming a physician. The enterprising young pharmacist simply didn't believe in how medicine was practiced at the time, viewing many physicians as charlatans. "I saw too much from the viewpoint of where certain doctors, where you have a little pain in the head, would say it was neuralgia and have the patient come 2 or 3 times a week. I suppose I didn't like that angle of it." Medicine, for George, would have crossed that line between right and wrong he had created. When Remus considered other options, he thought about a career in the law as a possibility. He had needed legal representation on several occasions, and his attorneys were intelligent and respected in the community. The young man also perceived law as more thrilling, whereas medicine might feel like the work he was already doing as a pharmacist. "I figured that the law practice had a larger field for future activities, and I was tired of looking at the same 4 walls," he said. With the same enthusiasm that had helped him attain his pharmacy license as a teenager, George plunged into the idea of studying the law. But first he had to find a school that would enable him to continue the pharmacy operations a little longer. Seeing a nearby program listed in the Chicago Tribune classified ads under Instruction, where it promised the best preparation for business and public life, Remus enrolled at the Illinois College of Law. The school offered classes during the day and at night, which enabled George to alternate his schedule, sometimes taking regular classes and other times.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?